Assalamu alaikum, how are you all? So we are just heading towards the end of our course, and our final few classes are just remaining. Okay, today we will be, as you can see on your screen, we will be discussing the war against terrorism, a very important issue, and the role of Pakistan in this war against terrorism, right? This is a very important topic and a very current kind of issue, so definitely you would take interest in it, and it will be an interesting debate between during this class. Okay, first of all, what is the war against terrorism? Can anybody tell me what is the war against terrorism? Why do we call it a war against terrorism? Okay, and anybody who can tell me about terrorism? Okay, fine. So terrorism is basically an act of, there is no agreed upon definition of terrorism, right? You need to keep it in mind that though we have been fighting against terrorism for the past let's say 16 or 17 years, but still we do not find an agreed upon definition of terrorism. This is a dilemma, right? So in most of the cases, a terrorist for one might be a freedom fighter for the other, right? Just take the example of Palestine. They call it terrorist, but for the Palestinian people they are the freedom fighters. Then take the examples of the people who are fighting against the Indian occupation in Kashmir. They call it terrorism, but for the people they are freedom fighters, right? So this is and then if you come up with an agreed upon definition of a terrorist or terrorism, then the problem is that a terrorist for one country might be a freedom fighter for another country or for other people, so they would not agree with that. For example, if you include state terrorism in terrorism, then you can say that India is a terrorist state because it is committing atrocities in the Indian-held Kashmir. Then Israel is a terrorist state because it is committing atrocities against the non-incumbents or the civilian people of Palestine or the Arab Muslims living over there in that area, right? And if you include state terrorism, then what about those 6 million people who died according to our report in Iraq after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003? So this is a problem in the definition of terrorism, right? So that is why no two countries or no more than a few countries can agree on one definition of terrorism. So everybody defines terrorism according to his or her own wishes or designs or agendas. But a general definition for understanding of terrorism is, I should give it to you, is that any act of violence which is basically directed to achieve some political objectives, right? Like achieving your political objectives and then resorting to acts of violence for the achievement of those objectives by the non-state actors, by the individuals, that becomes, a terrorist act. This is a very close, this is a definition which many people agree upon this definition, but still there is a universal definition of terrorism is missing, or terrorist is missing, right? Okay, now come to the war against terrorism. So this is, as it shows that the name is showing that this is a war against what? Against terrorism, right? That this is a war against terrorism. What is it? Basically, the whole thing, it's a very detailed story, but in September 2011, there were terrorist attacks on the soil of the United States of America, right? So on that fatal day, about 3,000 people lost their lives in several terrorist attacks on the US soil, and planes were hijacked. As you all know, you must know about it, right? I think, how many of you know about the 9/11 and what happened over there in the United States of America on that day? I'm sure you must have been of very small age at that time, but still, you know, you are watching. This is the era of media. You are watching television, and you would have seen those pictures, you know, where two planes are hitting. See, you have seen it. Okay, so basically this is the 9/11, and that was the 9/11. So we call it 9/11, right? Why do we call it 9/11? Because it was 11th date and September the 9th month, right? So that is why it is 9/11. It is called 9/11. Okay. Al-Qaeda, a network which we will be discussing in detail in this under this topic, a network. It just trained a few pilots, and those pilots hijacked some plane. A plane was, hatched in the mountains of Afghanistan for this attack, and then it was executed in the United States of America. They say it was on the behest of the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, right? So that plane attacked, those planes attacked the World Trade Centers, and these tall buildings, they are not present now. They are nowhere then. They are not nowhere right now, right? They were just demolished on the very day when that attack occurred. Then another plane was crashed near the Pentagon, or a part of the Pentagon building, which is, you know, the headquarters of the security apparatus of the United States of America. So that was hit, right? And another plane was crashed in Pennsylvania, right? So this was a very well coordinated attack, and the hijackers, they had planned it meticulously, right? So it was kind of a slap on the face of the United States of America, because it considered itself to be safe, and it is and it was the sole superpower, as we have been discussing this time and time again. I'm telling you that it is the sole superpower. So it was a disgrace for the United States of America, right? Not only injury, but it was a disgrace as well. So it had to retaliate, and then it retaliated. It came to this region after Al-Qaeda and Taliban, who had given refuge to Al-Qaeda for many years. It came to this region, and it started a war against terrorism, right? So basically this is a brief history of the war against terrorism. That is just an overview which I presented. We'll be discussing it in detail to walk around all important facets of this issue, right? With respect to Pakistan, and fitting the Pakistani angle into an international context as well, right? So we will be discussing that. So this is how it started, right? As I have discussed. Now, after the 9/11, terrorism became a serious problem in the international relations, right? It was the first time in the recent history that the United States had been confronted with such a huge disaster threat on its own soil. So it was after the 9/11 incident, or that terrorist act, that in international relations, terrorism became a very serious concern for states. Previously, they would ignore terrorist activities because it was not on such a mammoth level. But now, the level of terrorism, terrorists were just taking it to the next level, right? Previously, there used to be small bombings, like there was a bombing in the US embassy in, I guess, in Kenya, all right? And previously, before this, there was a bombing in the basement of the World Trade Center. But it was a huge center, so it could not do anything like in the parking of and it could not even destroy a pillar. So, but now they were taking it to another level. The terrorists were taking it to another level, right? Like hijacking a plane full of people, innocent people, and then crashing it, slamming it into the buildings, and destroying the buildings, the people in the buildings, and the people in the planes. So it was, it was something beyond the imagination of the world, and it really shocked the whole world, right? So now that is why it was taking a prominent position in the policy, in the international relations. A prominence was given to deal with the issue of terrorism. So the United States of America then started doing something about this issue, right? Well, and the whole world, almost the whole world followed it, right? Because it was facing a threat, and when the United States of America situated thousands of miles away from Afghanistan, and if these terrorists can reach over there, then they can reach anywhere, right? So that was the pretext under which this war against terrorism was started, and if they can reach now, they can reach again, right? If they have reached now, they can reach again to the United States. So in order to stop them, we need to get into Afghanistan to, hit them in their bed, rather than, awaiting them for getting up and coming towards us and then responding to that threat. So it was a preemption, a policy of preemption. The policy of preemption, an active policy. It is before the act of attack, you are basically going there to destroy the potential attacker before he would have even committed attack. But the potential is there, so just go and destroy it. So this is basically preemption. Now, maintaining internal security and protecting its global interest became challenge for the American leadership after the 9/11. Now it was visible that internal security at home, they needed to maintain it, because once they became the sole superpower in the 1991, after the in the 1990, after the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, when they became the sole superpower, then what happened was that they were planning to remain on that position, like the position of the world's leader, or the leadership position in the world. So they wanted to retain that position. Now for that, internal security mattered a lot, but that internal security was breached, right? The shell or the security of the United States of America, that was breached. So that was important for them to ensure that that would not happen again, right? One aspect of it was that. And then there were, since it was a global power, the sole superpower, so there are many global interests, right? There are many global interests involved. So that is why the United States of America wanted to ensure that the global interests, the global interest of the United States of America are also protected, right? So that became a challenge after the 9/11 attack. They saw it as a big challenge, because if the US is involved, I will get back to this point at some point during this discussion. That became a challenge for them, that if the US is involved in pursuing its policies beyond the borders of the US, across the Atlantic Ocean, across the Mediterranean or in the Middle East, and if someone is not happy with those policies, then that particular person or that organization might attack us. So why not to go there and eliminate those people who are not happy with our policies in the Middle East, and they are attacking us because of our policies in the Middle East, right? So why not go there and attack them so that they cannot do anything about our policies in future, and we do whatever we want to do, because I'm a global leader and I want to pursue my own interest, and this is absolutely right. Whoever is in power will pursue his or her own interest. So the United States of America is a powerful country, was a powerful country, and it was pursuing, this is realism in international relations, right? So it was doing whatever it felt was best for its interests, so it was doing that, right? But then that was the repercussion. The terrorism was, and Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was a repercussion or consequence of its Middle East policy, right? Otherwise he was trained by the United States of America, but we will discuss that in the background or in the detail when we go deep into this topic. Well, then the solution which was presented was a new kind of war against a new kind of enemy, right? So now this is a new kind of war, not a conventional war where two state armies are fighting each other, right? There was an invisible enemy, right? And then there was a state army, the United States of America, and armies of many other states as well. But then, you know, these armies were, so they were, asymmetry was there in both these fighters. One was a conventional army and the other was, you know, using guerrilla tactics and things like that, and it was a faceless enemy, but still they wanted to pursue it. The US wanted to pursue it to find a solution to this problem. And then the solution which they presented was the war against terror or war on terror, right? So that was the solution. That now they have a war not on or against the USSR, but a war against terrorism. And wherever they find terrorists, they will go there and they will. So, you know, it was kind of a global war. They initiated a global war against terrorism. As a result, in 2001, they launched a campaign against Al-Qaeda network, which they held responsible for attacks and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Right? I've been telling you in the previous classes that over here then the role of Pakistan comes. Right? We just touched upon in the geographic, geostrategic importance of Pakistan upon this topic, but now we will be dealing with it in detail. What did Pakistan do over the course of so many years, and what were the US demands, and how these demands were fulfilled or not fulfilled or something like that, right? And okay, but that was the aim. Al-Qaeda was situated in Afghanistan, and the Taliban regime was friendly towards Al-Qaeda. So the United States of America attacked Afghanistan for harboring these terrorists and the terrorist network, right? Okay. So it embarked on the enterprise with the support of many other countries, including the United Kingdom, NATO member states, and non-NATO countries such as China and Pakistan, right? But Pakistan's support has been most strong in terms of access, like, you know, Pakistan provided basing sea and air access, and then intelligence support and logistics to the United States of America. So Pakistan's support, again, you can link this thing with the geographical importance of Pakistan, geostrategic importance of Pakistan, right? The previous topic which we have been discussing. But now Pakistan's support in these terms was very important. So that is why we are discussing the role of Pakistan in war against terrorism, right? Okay, now what is the relevance of 9/11 with the Cold War? Okay, the Cold War, how many of you know about the Cold War? Have I discussed that Cold War in the previous classes? Tell me, what is a Cold War? How many of you know about it? Okay, Cold War, that was, you're right, Cold War was that that the war between, not direct war, but confrontation between the USSR and the United States of America, which lasted from 1945, escalated and normalized, but escalated at times up till the dismemberment of the USSR, and the final act or the final battleground of the Cold War was Afghanistan, right? Vietnam was one of the act of the Cold War, then the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there are many events which occurred during the Cold War, because it is a 45 years long confrontation between the two most powerful countries of the world, right? And it was an era of bipolarity, which I have been discussing, right? So, but the roots of the 9/11 event, they can be traced in the Cold War. The 9/11 can be linked with the Cold War, and particularly the conflicts in the 1980s of the Cold War, right? So these conflicts in the 1980s were 1979 Afghanistan was invaded, 1988 Russian troops withdrew from Afghanistan. So these conflicts of the Cold War, we are talking about these issues of Afghanistan, particularly relating to Afghanistan. What happened during that? The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 to halt the fundamentalist rebellion against the Kabul regime and forestall the possibility of a Western involvement in the civil war. Now, in the previous classes, I might have discussed that briefly, that there was a Saur revolution in Afghanistan. In previous classes, like when I was discussing the 1971 issues and the issue of dismemberment of Pakistan, I had already referred to these things. But there was a Saur revolution in Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union was exporting socialism or communism to Afghanistan, to the neighboring countries, because it was on an expansionist trajectory. So it was exporting these revolutions or these revolutionary ideas to the neighboring countries, and Afghanistan could not remain out of the fold of that Soviet ideological fold. So Pakistan could not remain out of that fold. Then what happened is that there were revolutions. A Saur revolution began in Afghanistan, and the Khalq and the Parcham and these, the socialist kind of tendencies, they were found, political parties were formulated, and they tried to sabotage the conventional Afghan government. And then in order for that revolution to be successful, the Soviet Union first of all thought that that revolution would be successful and it would sustain itself, but then it could not do that. So in order to do that, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, right? Just to ensure that that revolution will take place, and the Western efforts, since it was the Cold War, so the West would definitely try to support those people who are against the revolution, right? So it wanted to stall the Western efforts which were there in Afghanistan and which were resisting the revolution in Afghanistan, the communist revolution in Afghanistan, and that was right. So that's why Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Now when it invaded Afghanistan, things became really dirty, right? And then at the same time, another great change occurred across the western border of Pakistan, where a revolution. Now this is the Shah of Iran, right? As I have been telling you that in the previous classes, the United States doesn't want a nuclear Iran because of its revolutionary regime, right? So it had good relations with Iran before the revolution, but in 1979, it was almost the same year, a revolution was brought in by the revolutionaries in Iran, and the US embassy was sieged, and more than 400 days their embassy was sieged by the revolutionaries, and you know, it was a very tense situation at that time. So this was occurring in the region, right, at that time, and it was the era of Cold War, and the United States of America could not afford to let things happen the way they were happening. So it just tried to somehow manage things in its favor. Then the cumulative effect of the historic events of Pakistan's doorstep was an upsurge in terrorism in many manifestations in the country. Right now, we will be explaining it. What were these manifestations? Right. First of all, what happened was that the local Pashtun fighters, they started resisting the Soviet forces, the Soviet troops in Afghanistan. When they started resisting these troops, since there was war going on in the country, so many people migrated to Pakistan as well, in order to for safety of their lives, right? So they migrated to Pakistan. That was early 1980s and late 1979, 80, 81, 82. They migrated to Pakistan, and there was, as I have been discussing this in one of the previous classes, that there was a dictatorship in Pakistan at that time. General Ziaul Haq was there. So he was in charge of the affairs of the country, and analysts in Pakistan thought at that time that it might be, that was Cold War, it might be that the Soviet Union, after solidifying its base in Afghanistan, might try to invade Pakistan using the same tactics. So, and then have access to the warm waters, and so it was kind of a fear in the mindset of the policymakers of Pakistan, and that's why they, first of all, they open-heartedly supported the Afghan Mujahideen. They embraced them in Pakistan. Then they were already in the fold of the capitalist bloc. They were allies of the capitalist countries. So and then the communist was invading. So that's why Pakistan supported the efforts of the capitalist bloc against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And what happened is that the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agencies, and the Inter-Services Intelligence of Pakistan, this is a US agency, and this is ISI Pakistan, right? They trained different fighters like Arabs, Afghans, and the Pakistani militants, and they organized these fighters against the so-called infidels, or the infidels, whatever you call it, right? But they organized them, and they started assisting different kinds of operations by these fighters in Afghanistan against the Soviet troops, right? So what did they do? That the area, which is the tribal area of Pakistan, known as the federally administered tribal area, or FATA, that area was used because it was bordering Afghanistan. So people from Afghanistan would come to Pakistan through those mountainous areas, and then they would at times reach to the settled districts of Pakistan like Peshawar, Quetta, and other districts which would border these tribal areas, and close to Afghanistan and the Pashtun dominated areas, but settled. So either they would reach these areas, or they would just be settled over there in those areas. But normally the camps for the refugees, Afghan refugees, they were settled in the settled areas of Pakistan. But the fighters were trained in the FATA, and it was easy for the fighters to launch attacks against the Soviet Union from FATA, because the terrain is almost the same like Afghanistan. The terrain of FATA is almost the same like Afghanistan. So they would launch attacks on the USSR during the Cold War. Now what happened afterwards, that after the withdrawal of the USSR as a result of these guerrilla attacks, and fight which was waged by the US as a proxy war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. As a result, when they withdrew in 1989, Pakistan assisted in forming an Afghan government in Kabul composed of the warlords. Now this is a very complicated thing. I think that I should take some time over this one. That the United States of America used Pakistan just like a tissue paper in the Afghan war, right? They used Pakistan to achieve their own purpose, and after getting their purpose, since the theater of the Cold War was now shifting to Europe, and Afghanistan was a chapter which was closed for the US. It was closed after the withdrawal of the USSR, and then they were focused on the complete dismemberment of Soviet Union, and there were many other scuffles, small scuffles going on and rivalries going on in the Eastern European area. So the shift, the focus of the US was shifted from this region to the European theater, right? So Pakistan was unfortunately used like a tissue paper in the Afghan war, and then Pakistan was left alone to deal with the issue of Afghanistan and to deal with the issue of Afghan refugees. And this was very unfortunate for Pakistan at that time, and I consider this as a very strategic blunder by the United States of America at that time, and that is why we are now fighting this war against terrorism. Otherwise, without that strategic blunder, we would not have been here, right? By the United States of America, particularly, that it did not even bother to look back towards Pakistan and try to help Pakistan in managing Afghanistan and then rehabilitating the Afghan refugees in Afghanistan, and in a composed manner, so that things could remain in control. But it did not do that, and things went out of control then, right? So Pakistan tried to form a government, Afghan government in Kabul composed of the warlords, but then that did not happen because these fighters and these warlords, they were fighting and everybody was trying to have his share in the power. So that was not happening, right? And a civil war broke out, right? When this civil war broke out, that was against the government in Kabul, which was just limited to Kabul, but still it was it had its legal sanctity, so that is why we call it a government. So that government in Kabul, and there was warlords in Afghanistan. There were warlords everywhere in Afghanistan, and many hundreds of warlords were fighting each other, and many practices were happening in Afghanistan which the Pashtuns and the Muslims thought that those kind of practices should not have happened, right? And in the middle of that thing, an incident just triggered the event of revolutions, or the rise of Taliban, and then Taliban came to power over 2 years of fighting. Then they finally captured Kabul and established their capital in Kandahar, and only 5% of Afghanistan remained out of the control of the Taliban government. It was with the Northern Alliance, Ahmad Shah Massoud and the rest of the. So during that time, what happened was that these fighters who have been trained by the US and Pakistan in order to counter Soviet Union, those fighters remained in FATA and in Afghanistan, and when Taliban came to the power, one of those fighters was Osama bin Laden as well. But to remind you that during the whole process, there was a Gulf the first war of Gulf had already occurred in 91-92, right, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and then the United States of America, on the request of Saudi Arabia, came to the Middle East, stationed its troops in Saudi Arabia, and countered the Iraqi effort, and liberated Kuwait from the clutches of Saddam Hussein. So that happened, and the United States of America just went there to the Middle East and stationed its troops after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. It stationed its troops there, while the Arab fighters who were brought into Afghanistan by the United States of America and the General Intelligence Department of the Saudi intelligence, along with the ISI. So, you know, they were stationed over here in Afghanistan, and they were fighting for an Islamic system in Afghanistan, kind of that, because they were motivated by religious ideology. They were not fighting for the US. They were fighting against the Soviet Union, and the US was helping them, indoctrinating them with the Islamic ideology, because at that time the Islamic ideology suited the US interests, right, to counter the Soviet Union. So it did that. The Mujahideen and these Taliban and these Al-Qaeda, they were there, and over there in the Middle East this thing happened. And then Osama bin Laden, from a rich family, in his view, he was against all that happening in the Middle East, right? So he kind of, turned against the United States of America. He was, first he was an ally, and then the following events in the Middle East, those events made him an enemy, right? And he considered the US his enemy, and the US considered him as their enemy, right? He remained in different areas in Sudan and here and there, and then in the pursuit, in order to eliminate Osama bin Laden, the US had already planned some surgical operations, like firing missiles into Afghanistan in the late 1990s, right, in Bill Clinton's era, and these kind of things were happening. But then they found this 9/11, right? Because now these Taliban, then they found their target, and they hit their target on 9/11, these terrorist attacks, and it was basically a baggage of the Cold War in Afghanistan. So now you get how this thing is linked with the Cold War, or the final conflict of the Cold War. So this was kind of a baggage of the Cold War, right? That the United States of America, it was its own doings during the Cold War and in the aftermath of the Cold War that basically invited many enemies towards it, towards the United States of America, and then it was attacked, right? So when it was attacked, and then it retaliated. So this is a kind of a background of it, right? Then it retaliated in shape of Operation Enduring Freedom. This is OEF. Operation Enduring Freedom was launched in Afghanistan, right? The US and the coalition forces launched this operation to save Americans from another 9/11 attack, as that was visible, that if they can reach once, then they can reach again as well, right? So that was why it was considered important to stop such kind of events from happening in future, right? Then Pakistan supported and cooperated with the United States of America and the coalition forces in the Operation Enduring Freedom, right? Without the support of Pakistan, this operation could not achieve whatever it has achieved, or whatever it had achieved, right? So it could not achieve these things, these goals. The goal of invading Afghanistan after 9/11 was to dislodge the Taliban. Now this is important because they had harbored Al-Qaeda, right, and capture Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan. So this was the goal of this invasion of Afghanistan, to first of all capture Al-Qaeda operatives and then dislodge the Taliban, because they had given refuge to Al-Qaeda, right? So this was happening after 9/11. Then the US succeeded in removing the Taliban, but they re-emerged as a force, particularly in the Pashtun region. So the Taliban could not resist the UN mighty military. It succumbed to it, and it was overthrown. The Taliban government was overthrown in Afghanistan, and another government was installed, Hamid Karzai, later on, right? But Taliban just initially they had vanished. They just vanished, and in the common population, among the common population of Afghanistan. But later on they re-emerged. For a few years, 1 or 2 years, they were like not there, very much not there. But then they started to reorganize and re-emerge, and now this is a common practice or a common pattern that every year in the month of spring, the United States of America and its allies and the Afghan National Army as well, they face a spring offense or spring offensive from the Taliban, right? So they are now consistently doing that, and the Taliban then re-emerged, particularly in the Pashtun regions where they were from, basically, right? Then Pakistan played, an important role. It deployed a large number of troops. Now this is very important because things are going to get worse for Pakistan as a result of some of its actions in the war against terrorism. But then it deployed a large number of troops along Afghan border in support of the OEF, Enduring Freedom Operations, right? So I will be calling it OEF, and employed a large portion of its logistic reserves to support the coalition, right? Because the coalition troops could not sustain in Afghanistan without the logistic support, and Pakistan was willing to provide that logistic support to the coalition troops in Afghanistan. It was like a lifeline for the coalition troops in Afghanistan, right? Then the Taliban and Al-Qaeda member, on the other hand, have managed to reassemble in the tribal areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Since they were already living there, some of their sympathizers were there. They had even intermarried with the tribal people, right? So their links were there in the tribal, and that was during the final conflicts of the Cold War, after the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, when FATA was used as a launching pad against Afghanistan. So these Taliban and Al-Qaeda members, on the other hand, then they managed to reassemble in the tribal areas of Pakistan because of these reasons, right? And it was natural. It was natural that they had fought for they had been there for almost 1979 and 2001, so almost like 22 years they have been there. So they had learned the language, the local languages, the local people had knew them, they knew the local people, and it was kind of a mixed kind of culture where the Arabs and the Afghans and the Pashtuns, and they all were feeling like one nation, and they had relationships with each other, good social relations were established between them. So it was easy for them to reassemble in these areas again, right? So they did that, and it is a wrong impression that the West is basically attributing towards Pakistan, that Pakistan basically helped them. No, I think in my objective opinion, I think that this is a wrong impression. Pakistan did not do that, but that was a natural outcome of the history. There was a long history behind it. So that was a natural outcome of it, right? Pakistan did not do that. I think the United States of America, by leaving Pakistan alone to handle the problem of Afghanistan after the withdrawal of Soviet Union, is equally responsible for doing it, right? So for creating such kind of a chaotic situation in this region and then leaving it, and then that was the natural outcome of it. Then nobody is powerful enough to create such kind of social dynamics and then do things, but that was a situation was evolving. This is my personal view, you might differ with me, right? Okay, so the terrorist activities are increasing, and they were at that time they were increasing rapidly. The economy of Pakistan has been sliding downward because of all these things, of these terrorist activities. On the one hand, the United States of America is there, Pakistan is providing support to the US. On the other hand, these Taliban, these militants, they are reassembling in the regions of Pakistan, and they are targeting the United States of America. So what is happening is that the foreign direct investment in Pakistan, that just fell down, and it was a high level of security risk, because Pakistan was considered as a high level security risk, so nobody was willing to invest in Pakistan's economy, right? So the cumulative economic impact runs into billions of dollars, and Pakistan is likely to continue to suffer as long as there is no peace in Afghanistan, and this is true. Without peace in Afghanistan, Pakistan cannot prosper, right? Pakistan cannot see prosperity, particularly in the areas which are close to Afghanistan, like the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and FATA and Balochistan. These regions, they will suffer the most than the rest of the Pakistan, as far as Afghanistan is unstable. So this is basically a problem for Pakistan, and that is why if Pakistan in this pretext, because it is the immediate neighbor of Pakistan, so Pakistan should be more concerned about it than the rest of the world, because nobody else has that much stakes in Afghanistan as Pakistan has. So that is why it is understandable that Pakistan is more concerned in Afghanistan's matters, because Pakistan has been facing the brunt of instability in Afghanistan, right? So it is understandable in international relations that Pakistan would take care of the issues in Afghanistan in its own interest, not to destabilize Afghanistan, but it's in its own interest. Okay. Then the international community response to the war against terrorism. India response. Now, what is the Indian response to the war against terrorism? You see, when this 9/11 occurred in 2001, and when analysis and analysts started to propose that the United States of America should do this and that, when the policymakers started proposing about the invasion of Afghanistan, and in the initial, after 9/11, in the initial 2 or 3 weeks before the Afghanistan was actually attacked, so the Indian response was quite naive. It was like a kind of a response from Atal Bihari Vajpayee and his administration. It was the kind of a response that was showing that, see, now Pakistan is badly trapped, and if Pakistan does not give way to the United States of America, India is willing to do that, right? And in the process, what would have happened with Pakistan, that cannot be explained right in an appropriate manner, because India's design after the 9/11, these designs were anti-Pakistan. It was a conflict, and in this conflict India was also trying to get something out for itself from this conflict, because now Afghanistan is about to be invaded. Previously there were Taliban who were anti-Indian. Before that there was a pro-Indian government in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has always been pro-India, except for the phase where Taliban were ruling Afghanistan, and now the United States of America is against the Taliban. So that is why these Taliban should be ousted now, and a pro-Indian government should be installed in Afghanistan to to make Pakistan suffer from that front, front as well. So that was the ultimate design, and India had already proposed that it would provide proper support for launching attacks into Afghanistan by the United States Air Force if it is asked, or if Pakistan does not provide that kind of support to the United States. So that was the Indian response, right, to the war against terrorism, and it was alarming for Pakistan. Pakistan could not afford that, keeping in view its rivalry with India, right, historical rivalry with India. Then the international community fully supported the strikes on the Taliban. Pakistan was also among the supporters. It also supported the strikes against Taliban, right. Then indeed, over a month after the Operation Enduring Freedom began, the Security Council condemned the Taliban for allowing Afghanistan to be used as a base for export of terrorism. Now, Taliban were suffering because of this reason, that they allowed it to be a base of terrorist groups for providing safe havens to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and other associated with them. So Taliban were basically punished for this crime, that why did they do that, right? But there are some writings, I have been through some writings in which a discussion has been quoted by Steve Cole in one of his writings about an ex-ISI chief with the Taliban, not chief, but an ex-ISI official with the Taliban leaders in Kandahar, where they were there to negotiate about the passage of the oil and gas pipelines from Afghanistan to to Pakistan, and then to the to Gwadar and to the ports of Pakistan, and help the United States of America reach the resources of Central Asia via Afghanistan before the 9/11. And during that conversation, Steve Cole basically he just depicted on that theme that Mullah Umar he agreed with the demands of the United States of America at that time, that he would hand over Osama bin Laden, he would expel Osama bin Laden from Afghanistan, but Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network are not in control of the Taliban government, right? So it is written in Steve Cole's writing, you can search it, right? So basically Taliban felt helpless in the face of the Arab fighters, against the Arab fighters in Afghanistan, since the Taliban were not provided diplomatic support, but only 3 countries accepted them as a sovereign state, that was the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And they needed international support, but that international support was not there. So they relied on this influential rich person, filthy rich Arab, Osama bin Laden. They relied on him, and he was out of the control of the Taliban. They were indigenous, illiterate, you might say not highly qualified people, while the Arabs were. Right? They had exposure to the West and the rest of the things, so they were manipulating, they were using this state of Afghanistan in their favor, and they were out of the control of the Taliban as well at that time. So that was an alarming situation for the Taliban, and they suffered for their crime for not controlling the activities of Al-Qaeda and providing them an open field to do whatever they wanted to do and launch attacks even against the United States of America. So that was a crime, and it cannot be denied, right? Nobody should be able to use the soil of any other country against anyone else. So, but if someone is doing so, then logically the country which would have been hit would definitely retaliate against that state as well, right? So that was a logical response. Okay. Then the war on terror launched with the broad base of international support, and the Northern Alliance ousted Taliban from power because it was launched with the help of the Northern Alliance. The ground attack was launched from the north, and it was helped. Ahmad Shah Massoud was killed 2 days before the 9/11, but his supporters were there, his loyalists were there. So that ground attack was basically launched against the Taliban from that front, and the air attack was launched from the eastern side, where Pakistan supported them initially and provided an air corridor. We will be discussing that later on. Then Germany, France and the Netherlands and a few other countries contributed towards the development assistance in Afghanistan, because it is commonly believed that development and war, they go hand in hand. If you want to bring peace to someone, to overthrow a regime and then bring peace to the country, so you should not only focus on fighting, but you should also focus on the development work as well, so that they can complement each other. You are targeting the bad elements, and wherever the area is cleared, you are developing that area in order to retain it. So basically they just helped out Afghanistan, and they are helping out Afghanistan in the development efforts as well, or development projects are going on in Afghanistan as well. So we will be inshallah discussing the rest of the issues related to the war against terrorism and the role of Pakistan in a war against terrorism in the coming class. Have a good day. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.